All right. Goedemorgen, good morning. Thanks for showing up at 9 o'clock on the second day. Hangover slot, I think it's called. Yes, thanks for coming. My name is Roy. I'm a user experience designer. I'm a UX maintainer for Drupal core itself, and I'm a freelance UX consultant as well. And today, my assumption for this talk is that you, as a front-ender, sometimes feel that you are not getting enough from your UX designer, your visual designer, etc., to really do what you want to do, or to really be able to do what you need to be doing. And so stuff is not always complete, right? And what I want to do today is frame the large UX process a bit to get us on the same page, and then look what you can do now as a front-ender where you're working now, and then look at possible steps you can take to maybe get involved earlier so that you can get some impact and help shape the actual project and what you get to do afterwards. So get involved earlier. So yeah, that's the agenda. Some process overview, and once we have the process overview, the other three will make sense as well. So let's go. Goedemorgen. So this is not a role that we're describing. This is not something one person does, but this is what a whole team works through, right? There's many modules that describe a design process, but I'm finding that this works. Clients understand this, it makes sense, and that's always useful. So it's called the double diamond, and from left to right, there's an idea, there's an initial trigger for some kind of project. So why should we do something? Well, that's where you discover. That's your discovery, right? Why do something with that idea or that trigger or that challenge or that problem? That is some exploration. Then once you've explored enough, you can define a what, so that you have a plan. And from that plan, you can design and develop the execution. So you explore possible solutions in the design and develop, build the actual thing. So in a bit more detail, start with why, right? And why for a product or service design means that you get an idea, a picture, an image of what the customer is, who the customer is, so personas or mental models, you do profiling, interviews, etc. So you get your customer in focus, you have the market that you will operate in, so you look at the trends and what are the competitors doing, how are they differentiating themselves, and what could be your place in that. And from those you can derive really high level, the elevator pitch, the 1 or 2 tweets that capture what you're going to do. And from there you can also define a first very high level feature set of what should be in the service or product. And that feature set should be prioritized already a bit. So super high level. But that's answering the why. With that in place, you can start to answer some of those questions. So you come up with an initial concept. A visual concept, a concept for the scenarios or the journeys or the interactions that should be in it. You can define something for how you want it to be experienced. So you have design principles. You could formulate some of the identity, the branding, and the metrics. Define the success factors, right? What will you measure so that you know that you're doing the right thing? And let's not forget content. What are the key messages that you want to bring forward, and what is the strategy for how you will bring those forward? So when you define the what of what you're going to make, right? And that results in a plan. So that's your definition phase. Yes. So with a plan, maybe that's the backlog, right? Maybe that's the roadmap. You can then again start exploring. So that's why the diamond shape opens up again for a second time. And you can start answering the how. Visually, by sketching, by creating style tiles, by whatever Photoshops or sketch mockups you want to make. The same goes for the interaction. You define the necessary flows, your prototypes, wireframes, etc. And for the content, define a sitemap, a structure for your content, and the content model. And we'll get back to the content model. So in this second phase, we're both answering the how in two phases, right? We have a how here, how visually, interaction, and content. And based on that, I mean, there's probably more Photoshop versions than what get actually built. So when we develop, we focus again and zoom in on that one version that we want to build. So for design, that means detailed designs, define your components, the content, well, produce it, and code it, back end, front end, so that in the end you have something that you can actually ship. To summarize, in that first why and what, the design makes the strategy concrete and specific, so that you get towards a plan. Based on that plan, design and development iterate towards the best possible solutions within the constraints that you have. So that's the double diamond. And me personally, my role I often see as asking. I won't be helping clients really answering their why, but I will ask for the why, so that I can help define the what. If this is your goal, then we should make this and this. So I help and define the plan, and I also create the wireframes, prototypes, and the sitemaps, etc. So I'm bridging, and the second and the third part most often. And well, if front-enders are designers, developers, then you're probably mostly working in the how part of this process. So you see that a lot has already been done before it gets to your desk. So what can you do inside that phase to improve things, improve the how? Because well, UX designers and service designers, they can get quite megalomaniac, right? Everything is design. So it's about the customer lifecycle, from reach and acquire to develop the client relationships. We want to retain the client. We want to inspire him or her to buy some more. If we map that, then you get to the customer journey maps you often see, where we follow the customer on their cross-channel journey of using a product or service. And every time the customer interacts with some part of that service, that happens at what we call a touch point. So one of those elements is a touch point. And if that's a digital touch point, like a kiosk or a computer or a phone, then at that touch point, a certain scenario is available. I could be searching for hotels in Ghent. I could be booking the hotel. I could be checking in at the hotel. I enter my hotel room is a touch point. I check out, etc. And at each of those touch points, a scenario is available. And if that touch point is a digital one, it usually means that we're working through a sequence of screens. We have the customer working through a sequence of screens. And on that screen, all is well so far, right? We're orchestrating the touch point, the scenarios are in place, but if we don't watch out, it can be a very small detail that throws people off and never book that room. That's where we are on the level of a micro interaction. There's a couple of famous examples of a single form element or a single checkbox that can have a tremendous impact on the conversion. This is probably Amazon, where people were asked to create their account too early and just never placed their order. And on a site as large as that adds up, right? Similarly, well, just a single checkbox for just another setting, right? This is an interesting article about Firefox, a browser, which had some checkboxes in the preferences that could basically render your browser useless. I mean, it started with disabling JavaScript, etc. So single form elements, single interactions, these matter. The design is in the details. Who read this book? Who knows about it? It's a good one. It's short, 120 pages. This is where we arrive at the feel part for inside that how section, right? Micro interactions. And this book provides a super useful model for making sure that all these tiny interactions do the right thing with as minimal fuss as possible. This really is about single interactions, not even a complete feature, but a single interaction within a certain feature. Form design, right? We all work with forms a lot. Each field could have its own multiple micro interactions. I want to go through the model that Dan Saffer, the author, presents for micro interactions, because I think if you apply that to your work, you could easily find ways to improve and smoothen the flow for people. So what he explains is that the structure of micro interactions is that they're built up from a trigger. There's rules that govern the micro interaction. There's feedback based on the rules. And then there's loops and modes. All pretty self-explanatory, but still a trigger. If it's a button, make it look like a button. So there's something in the UI that tells you you can do something here. This is a trigger. And there's a couple of rules for it. The trigger is that what initiates the micro interaction. It should be recognizable. It should be predictable. It should do the same thing every time you click it. And you can prioritize these, right? The more important one should be more visible, bigger, color, contrast, etc. Once the trigger is fired, then there are certain rules that come into play, right? If I flip the switch for the light, then the simple rule is the light goes on and it stays on until I flip the switch again. But those rules can be pretty smart. So here there's an example of me writing the word attached, hitting send, and the mail client checking if there's even an attachment for real. And the rule says, hey, there's no attachment, and it shows this particular dialog. Rules. So they define what can and cannot be done. They don't start from zero, ideally. you want to use as few controls as possible and reduce the options, have some smart defaults, and use these rules to prevent errors. Feedback. So the feedback exposes the rules, makes the rules visible. We see multiple items of feedback here. The grayed out text of steps that have already been taken, the highlighted step with the arrow background. There's a progress bar. Then the installed text module is text that updates, and there's a counter even running and a percentage counter. Maybe even a bit much feedback, very explicit, very verbose maybe. But that's what feedback does, right? Feedback is for understanding the rules. And ideally, you know some of the context so that you can tailor the feedback. And so that last one, link feedback to the control or the resulting behavior. That's why we want in-place form errors and not that big error message on top of every page. That's not in context. Loops and modes, last bit. Loops, simply, if I spin up a test site on a simply test for Drupal, then a counter starts counting down. That's a loop counting down to the 25 minutes, which ends my demo. And a mode, that is long. Yeah, sorry, this is a long loop. This loop was like 25 minutes, could be shorter, of course. So you have short loops and there's long loops. This is an interesting one. This is something Drupal definitely does not do. This is layer vault, I think. Yeah, that's a version control for graphics files. It has this primary button, the signpost, and over time, as you use it more often, the emphasis is decreased. So this could take possibly weeks. This is a really nice touch for a micro interaction, scaling down its presence because people get used to it, a long loop. A mode, classic. A mode is a fork in the rules. So the classic example is the shift key on your keyboard. You press the shift key and all the behavior of all the other keys changes. So the rules, there's a fork in the rules there. Another basic example is setting screens. You don't want the setting for region and city on the same screen as the clock itself. So you use modes when there's an infrequent action like settings that would clutter the primary interaction. So you give it its own screen. So maybe very straightforward, but if you break all the JavaScripty things, all the form handling things down in a way like this, I think you'll hopefully find room for improvement, right? And smoothen the workflow for people. Micro-interactions. Van harte aanbevolen, doe er een voordeel mee, zou ik zeggen. In preparation for this presentation, I asked on Twitter what people miss in what they get from the UX, UI, or visual designers. Some interesting responses there. An important trend, the things you don't see. The second one says, especially things you don't see, like interactions, focus and hover states, interaction on mobile. Even labels for icon-only controls, tab flow for tabbing through forms, error messages. So guilty as charged, we don't have enough time, right? So and there's not always room to really spec all these things out. The bottom one is important too. What happens when there are thousands of things? What happens in the empty state, right? Can we have something special there? Error and incomplete. So Mark says problem, inconsistency, not taking into account changing content like longer titles, vertical images, where portrait images, where all the mockups were using nice looking landscape pictures. No customizations for the admin UI in a Drupal specific sense. Because the design is never 100% complete. Not all questions are answered. But ideally, a good design provides answers with consistency and a rationale. And based on consistency and rationale, it could answer questions that aren't even asked yet. You mean that the rationale and consistency would enable you as a front-ender to fill in the missing pieces? Yes. And Mark says yes. And I want to capture that rationale in my code. Not only this button is red, but this button is red because it's a call to action button. So what would be good to do there is create your own checklist. So that you can do an intake of the design. If you have built your own checklist with the error messages, with the responsive behavior questions, the tab flows, the high-res images you need. Who has a checklist? Who does the checklist thing-ish? Okay. Because all these things, I hope, are recognizable. But if you build a checklist, that's really useful. You can then make that gap, that stuff that you're missing, explicit. So, improving the how. We walked through some micro interactions and a framework for how you could find ways to improve there and create a checklist so that you can identify the gap and maybe fill in your own bits where necessary. Cliffhanger. But we're working in this how part of the process, right? And why and how, why and what have mostly already been decided on. Somewhere there's a concept, right? There's the cool Photoshop files and the pretty looking mockups that got signed off. Super visible, client happy, yes, this is what I'll get. And this is input for, and I'm not sure if this works for all systems, but in a Drupal specific sense, that then becomes invisible because backend starts implementing things, start building things, start doing the backend development. So the concept is input for the backend, and a couple of sprints later, something bubbles up again above the surface, and then of course the hope is that the front ender will make it look exactly like the concept we had delivered. Not always true, right? So wouldn't it be nice if you could steer that briefing, that what, a bit more? First thing you could do is let's see. Right. Basically get a grip on the actual inputs. Right. So we made this checklist, right? Ideally, and that means that you can kind of validate the input, and you can say what is missing or not. Which means that you can suggest, hey, if this is missing, what are we going to do? Am I going to make my own assumption and do a quick and dirty fix, or do we get a quality solution? But dear project manager, that will be 2 days of work probably. So if you do that analysis based on your design intake, let's call it that, then you enable the whole team to make more considered trade-offs. Which should enable you to get a bit better predictable output of the input, so that backend delivers something that you had an impact on as well. So one of the things you want to be looking at there is that you match the components. Components is components. There's components for the content, right? There's blocks, chunks of content, but the styling, maybe the designer has different boxes in his design, and maybe the code, the underlying architecture of how that stuff gets rendered to the page, makes other assumptions or other structures for what is a component. So ideally, you want to map those together as much as possible. And to do that, it would probably be best to start from the content model. Content model defines the different content types in the system, their relations, and the ways they can be displayed. So this, say we were, this is not a sitemap necessarily. This is also not wireframes. Wireframes are not always super handy, right? Because there's a collection of stuff on the page, and the wireframe itself doesn't necessarily say where things are coming from. It's a collection of things. But based on your content model, you can see where things are coming from. So if we have an event site, there's probably a content type event, there's probably a content type session, there's a speaker, there's media for the slides or the video, the session has links to the media, the speaker has links to the media, there may be a news article that would also like to embed some of that media. Sorry. And maybe there's a venue content type. This is a super useful tool for discussions with clients as well. Sitemaps are pretty abstract, but if you go with them, am I right that you have products and press releases and white papers? Yeah, and is it true that from the product you want to link to some white papers? Yes, that makes sense. So this kind of diagram really is helpful in aligning the understanding of what should be in the site, in the application. And then you break it down, right, for each content type. So maybe the session, it has the title, right? Here we go in Drupal fields. Title, a short description, a long description. The speaker images is being picked up from the speaker note, so that's a reference. Speaker name as well. There's a room, a date and time, etc. So that's that left part. But you also can then decide how, in which variants that gets displayed. So maybe there's a search result that only shows the title and the short description. There's the title, speaker picture, and date name for some other kind of listing or a promotional block, and there's the full view. So there's the Drupal view modes, right? And if you can agree that and base that on the content, then you can also, ideally you would derive your components from the content so that you can also style and code around those same components. But there's another way. Instead of waiting for backend to surface the stuff they're working on, especially the risky bits in the plan, right? You can prototype. Prototyping is cool. You can mock up functionality where a Photoshop file mocks up the look. You can also mock up the feel, the flow, the interaction of a thing. And that's super powerful. Prototypes are super powerful. They're easy to understand by everybody because you can actually use them, which results in better feedback. If you're making an HTML in the source material that the actual product will be as well, you can make them responsive. I'm not exactly handy enough with HTML, CSS, and especially not JavaScript myself, to really pull it off on my own. But I produced a couple of prototypes together with a frontender. Hi, Sanne. And that was really super useful. This responsive behavior, there's no really good way to document it in Azure or in Photoshop, or there's always that just doesn't map to what you actually will get. Hey, I misordered the slide. Sorry. Prototype is easy to share, publish it somewhere on a URL. People can use it on their own device, which creates buy-in. Look, it's already doing something. Maybe it's still gray boxes and arrows, right? But it really creates involvement and buy-in. Super useful. The good thing about prototyping is also that it forces you to use real content. There's no getting, you won't be getting away with lorem ipsum in a prototype if you want people to work through that scenario. It has to be real. It's not necessarily easier, but it's better. Same goes for those links that you sometimes easily can add to your wireframe. And yeah, that does something, right? You have to be really specific here. And the good thing is that prototypes can be tested. So you can give them in the hands of the actual target audience, if you like, and you can run a small usability test or just get feedback. Which means that a prototype is worth like 1,000 meetings. It's really useful. So you would prototype the risky things if you get if you see the plan, you see a functional spec and a design, and you say, "Oops, that looks ambitious." Try to pick one or two of those critical pieces and try to mock up a prototype so that you can show where the complexity is. Show to your project manager as well that this is tricky. We either need more budget or we need to descope, and that's if you start having those discussions, then you're shaping the what of what you of the project, right? So that's basically prototyping. Really is your secret superpower. My wireframes will not do justice to the flow of the interaction, especially not on that micro interaction level that can be so important for how it really works. So yes, that's from how to what. Use that checklist to identify the gaps and open that discussion with your project manager and the team, so that you can make trade-offs. Use that checklist to get involved in shaping the project. Work together with your backend developer, and hopefully there's somebody responsible for the content, right? To match those components, right? To draw the boxes around the same things, and prototype the risky things, so that you can prevent basically from sinking a lot of backend development time into something that may not even be needed or could be simplified, etc. So prototype to find your way around difficult things in the scope. So why do we care about this? We care about this because the user experience is the result of all the small interactions combined. I hope that you will identify those small tweaks to reduce the complexity and smoothen the flow. That does pay off. Because for regular people, for the users of that product or service, the user interface is the app. And you as front-end developers provide exactly that interface, right? That basically that membrane around above all that functionality. And you expose the functionality to human beings, which is an important place to be in. And I hope that you'll make that membrane, that UI level, as user-friendly as possible. I hope I've given you some useful hints on how you can approach that. And that's my talk. Questions? What can we discuss? What were the gaps in my presentation? Nothing? Yes.
What kind of things are you putting in the checklist?
Yes. What things are in the checklist? You saw those tweets, right? The rationale. So that means a high-level briefing of why is this project happening. Well, the rationale is something you want to get, right? As part of the briefing, is the briefing complete in the sense that there's rationale behind the design decisions? Is there not only a Photoshop file, but also some document that basically captures the design principles? A simple example of a design principle is, maybe it's not anymore, but a design principle of Google was speed over everything. That's why the start page of Google is empty, right? Only a search field. And a design principle like speed over everything is something that helps you make decisions further down the road. Because if you find something in the interface that wasn't defined in the design, you have multiple options. Which one is the fastest? That's the one you can then choose. In that checklist, well, it depends, of course, but those error messages, the responsive behavior, typography, colors, so basically the style guide elements, I usually see those happen, right, in a Photoshop file with the H1 to H6 and a bullet list. Rationale and design principles, not so much. And the main scenarios that you want to that you need the user to work through, and all the details you saw there. So the responsive behavior, the error messages, why and when is that button big and red, etc. Yuda.
Yes, another question. Which of those steps from your presentation do your clients tend to skip, or they don't necessarily see value in? Like, for example, content modeling
That's so the question is, what kind of steps are easily skipped by the client because they don't see the value? So how do you make them pay for it? Well, either you make a really strong pitch that you need that extra budget, or you say, or you trade in some stuff, right? There's a lot of wireframes being produced often that really isn't that useful if you have a good content model. So sometimes I just swap inside the project. I really find that the content model really helps the discussion from the start with the stakeholders at the client side, down to the backend developer who knows the elements he needs to build, right up to the front end again, for expressing those in visually and functionally. That's also why that checklist could help, right? If you identify those gaps and you say, then you can make them clear, those gaps, to the client, and you say, okay, we're missing this. If there's no room to create it additionally, we're going to reduce the scope, or it will be not as nice, or we'll make assumptions. So whatever you can do to make the client understand the impact of what is missing is probably your best chance of getting them to invest in it after all.
So how do you deal with trying to keep things consistent? There's a lot of approaches from different sides. You have your style guide, but we are talking about micro interactions, so you really look closely.
Yes.
Try to build, combine some stuff that makes a user flow perfect.
Yep.
But eventually there would be another user flow where you try to reuse stuff, but you might end up in one micro interaction. You need some different approach or different elements. And how do you deal with the thing that in the end of a bigger project there might be a lot of things that are not totally similar, or to make them feel from that people really know and are guided, but you don't have to many things.
To rephrase the question, so how do we keep kind of integrity within the whole thing if there's many detailed, so if there's a lot of micro interactions, how do we take care of that the whole flow still makes sense, or if there's another flow that still matches? That is a challenge, yes. I would suggest that just like you don't get time to refactor your code, you will probably have a hard time in getting to refactor basically your design, right? But it would involve once in a while taking a step back. Are we still making sense? Are the design principles still the right ones? Because usually, hopefully, the design principles help keep things in check. And then you also want to make a decision on so how valuable is consistency? Is visual consistency the important thing, or is people getting to the button, and is conversion our thing? Define where do you know where it gets. You want to get an idea, I think, of decide for yourself, okay, when does it get off the rails? What does it mean that we're now outside the boundaries of what we want to do? And from there, you want to tweak at the right bit. But I have no recipe for that. But refactor, basically, right?
I think that one thing where it said, take a step back and look at more things and maybe try to make.
Are we still making sense?
In the
Yes.
combination or in the overall picture. So,
yes.
We're not.
Yeah, I mean, organic growth is how things get complicated, right? So once in a while, you want to decompose again and see if it fits together in a simplified way again. Yes.
Do you have a recommendation on how to go about creating this prototype? You mentioned you yourself wouldn't be able to do it, so you need a front-end developer. You obviously need a designer to get all the assets prepared. So you're somewhere in the middle and to moderate this process. So how do you go about this?
Question is a suggestion for how to go about creating the prototype. The way I've approached it is visually I downplay the visual stuff. So I don't, and I'm enough of a visual designer to at least create some hierarchy and to make some visual sense of what's on the screen. So me and a front-ender would be able to create a working prototype. I would suggest HTML, CSS, JavaScript for the prototype. I am not a front-ender, so I cannot suggest that you should or should not use Bootstrap or Foundation or something else. But start as simple as possible. I think we wrote some simple HTML, but it was PHP with some includes so that we could create a flow. You want to keep in mind that the prototype is basically for throwing away. So you don't want to get invested in it too much. So keep it as lightweight as possible. Be okay with messy code. Just make that flow happen and don't make that flow happen with clean code. Yeah. Vanilla. Yes. Yes.
So you talked about the checklist, and don't you think it's interesting to interact with the developer when you're designing more, but not always. For me, it's not always possible to prototype, or not always necessary to prototype. But don't you think it's interesting to sit together with the developer at some point in the design process?
Yes. So basically, the question is, how early do you get development involved, or shouldn't you? Shouldn't you? Yeah. Yes. Ideally, in that double diamond, once you get beyond that initial why and you start defining what to build, you want to do, especially for big stuff, you want to have an architect on that table as well, because the platform, the technology platform, is super important and helps shape what will be available. I focused on the front end here. Again, that maybe a bit Drupal specific, but that content model is super handy and super good discussion piece also with the backend developer, because he'll help me decide, it doesn't have to be a content type, could be a taxonomy term with some fields on it, and etc. Yes, I definitely want developers at the table as well, as soon as possible. Yes?
Another question. Could you give us a couple more examples for design principles, and what do you base them on?
Yes. More examples of design principles and where to base them on. The ones that immediately come to mind were the ones that were defined when Drupal 7 was redesigned, basically. So we had the D7 UX project where Mark Bolton and Lisa Reichelt were hired for a couple of months, basically, to define a high-level design approach for a better and newer, improved Drupal. So design principles, where do you derive them from? No, let's do the examples. So the examples there were designed for the 80% use case. So there's almost everybody uses the CMS to create content. A lot less people, much fewer people come to configure panels or views or rules in Drupal, in that CMS. So design for the 80%. Make it super easy to do the 80% use case and make the 20% use case doable. Provide sane defaults. So don't, Drupal has a very empty canvas approach to if you install Drupal. Drupal does everything, but it does nothing out of the box, right? It can do everything, but it does nothing out of the box. So one of the principles there was provide more useful defaults right out of the box. We didn't, but that was a design principle we didn't follow up on because discussions. So 80-20, provide sane defaults, speed over everything. Who knows some? There's lists. Sometimes there's, I mean, these are basic design principles, right? Make the obvious, make the most used of, make the most important thing bigger, make the logo bigger, make the most important button bigger. You pick them based on a mix of the functionality you want to achieve. Is this a super complex CRM that will only be used by people who are in the know? Then flexibility or configurability is maybe a more important part than super smooth, useful, usable interactions. So it depends on the functionality that you're actually presenting, the target audience. So who are you doing this for and what are they trying to achieve? So whatever helps those people achieve those things best is input for the design principles you choose. And your brand, your identity, your character can also be input for how you formulate or target those design principles. So based on your persona and the actual persona, so the audience and your own branding identity. But yeah, design principles, if you Google them, you'll find lists and you pick. It's not something you have to really invent all from scratch. Thanks again. Coffee.